Here on the Amanda the Jedi channel, we like to have fun. We like to dunk on things, but we also love to passionately talk about the things that we love. It usually takes me a little bit longer to do those things because if I'm passionate about it, I want to make sure I do it right? But yes, there's a lot of dunking that happens here. And we don't discriminate the dunking. I trash talk horror, mommy porn, action dramas, but I also often dunk on things that are intended for the young adult. But I never want to come across as someone who makes fun of people for the things that they like, unless it's Cats the movie. Again, those are the rules. If 13 Reasons Why is your favorite show, that is absolutely fine. I think that the first season is super captivating. I read the book back when it came out. I just don't like the progression that the show took, and I don't like what they did versus what they said their intentions were. But if it makes you happy, that's amazing. Same goes to all the other stuff I've ever talked about. There are tons of things that I know objectively have so many issues with them, but I still love them to some capacity. There is nothing wrong with loving what you love, again, as long as it's legal. But there's no denying that when it comes to the young adult world, particularly stuff that seems to be more intended for teenage girls, there is an insane amount of hate, and I do not think it's warranted. People already bring down the young adult identifier as if it's lesser in some way. It's like you hit 14 and they're like, time for the adult section for you, time to grow up, loser. Unless it's like Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, in which case you're good to go. As if there aren't a stack of classics that are in the young adult section that are taught in schools and university and that people hold dear to their hearts. I just said dear really weird. And I think that overall judgment for YA as an identifier is kind of pretty crappy. In my opinion, anything that gets someone reading is great. Whether it's Harry Potter or Twilight or comic books or anything else, if it's people reading, that is a net positive thing that should be encouraged. And that's not to say that there isn't any room for criticism within this sphere at all, or that there aren't problematic portrayals and tropes that get overused and trends that just keep getting fallen into. But the level of hate that gets brought down on the people who actually enjoy this kind of content is completely unwarranted. Because that's where I think the distinction lies. You can criticize, and people do criticize, everything from all walks of life, all over the place. But when it comes to the YA novel, more often than not, it's the people that read them that get heavily judged and criticized for daring to like the things that they like. Now, for those confused about what young adult or YA even is, let's do a little refresher and bring you up to speed. This isn't going to be a definitive history of like when this classification started. This is just supposed to give you like an overall idea of why it grew to be as big as it is, why people find issues with it, and what might have moved into this like higher level of criticism that we often see. So there's actually a lot of things in YA that I genuinely love. I mentioned this a ton when discussing movies, but it totally extends into books, but I am a sucker for a coming-of-age story. And by nature, many coming-of-age stories seem to fall under the young adult umbrella. Like, obviously, this isn't always the case. I've noticed we're seeing a big trend in, like, post-adolescent coming-of-age, where it's just, like, you know, people in their mid-20s to mid-30s who just have no idea what they're doing with their life. But yeah, I love this stuff. In the book world, I think it's actually referred to as contemporary stories, which are essentially just fictional stories that are grounded in what could be a reflection of our own reality. And they tend to involve characters that are navigating their way through personal and societal issues as they try to understand the world around them and themselves. So, you know, coming of age. And because these stories are a little bit less daunting to jump into, they can actually instill a love of reading in people that never learned how to do so. Like, so many people just got caught up in like the school curriculum of reading and just learned to hate it on the basis of that. So if something seems interesting to them, they shouldn't be dissuaded from reading it just because they're in their 20s and it's aimed at teenagers potentially. Because when you see someone hold up something like this versus something like this, and you're not a reader, but you kind of want to start, which one are you probably going to be drawn to? Because again, the Goldfinch is like 800 pages of relatively small-ish font versus The Perks of Being a Wallflower, which is, yeah, it's pretty small font, but this is also a pretty small book, both in, you know, width, height, and page length. And then obviously, even if you do find books that look smaller that are intended for adults, you might end up with something like a McCarthy, where like the prose and the way he writes is just very unusual and it takes a little bit to get into. So it might not necessarily be the most accessible thing to a new reader. That doesn't mean that YA is lesser because it condenses those plot points down into less time, so it's faster to get through. It's just different. And again, contemporary is just one piece of the YA pie. There's deep fantasy, urban fantasy, dystopian futures, aliens, mysteries, LGBTQ stories, alternate realities. There's just so much. YA stories vary just as much as every other genre of any kind of fiction there is, because it's just an overall descriptor of books that are intended to appeal to people aged, 13 to 14 to like 21. And again, that's not to say that somebody who's older than that age can't enjoy these books, and it's also not to say that there isn't something that might appeal to people that are under that age. It just allows them to get away with more than a kid book would and less than what an adult book might. And if anything, what's appropriate to be in the YA umbrella is actually growing as it increases in popularity every year. And I've also read YA books where characters do have sex, they do drugs, they can be brutally murdered, experience serious abuse, and a slew of other issues. And those boundaries seem to push a little bit more every year as that YA audience is growing, and publishers are trying to kind of bridge that gap between the YA world and the adult fiction world. I've honestly read books in the adult section that very easily could have been in the YA section based on the writing style and the themes and like the age of the characters within the story, but then get bumped up into the adult category for whatever reason. Could be something as simple as the characters being in college versus being in high school. But a lot of times there really isn't that much difference between what you're gonna find between the two sections. And because some of those things are so similar, I think we've largely done a disservice to YA by trying to write it off entirely. A lot of books we read in school are exactly intended for these audiences. Like Hatchet tends to fall in here, even though I think we read that when I was like 11. But then when you got to high school, they introduced The Outsiders and To Kill a Mockingbird, which are both very common and important pieces of literature that tend to get used for education purposes. Classic coming-of-age stories like Catcher in the Rye, which would go on to inspire the writing style of things like The Perks of Being a Wallflower. Harry Potter captured the imagination in the entire world. J.K. Rowling's shit takes aside, those books are obviously incredibly important to so many people, and they speak to a level of kindness and acceptance that she just doesn't seem to currently have. And again, just because they're intended for a younger audience demographic does not remove their validity in the space. Philip Pullman, Lois Lowry, Louis Sachar are all things that have inspired young readers for decades, and they have worth. And that's not to disregard the impact of newer authors either. There are tons of excellent novels being written for adolescents currently, and they shouldn't be seen as lesser just because of their classifier. But also there are obvious flaws within YA, but as mentioned, there's flaws in everything. Anyone who's paying remote attention to anything can tell that there are a lot of trends and tropes in these stories that are manufactured so that they can build off the popularity of other series. Once Harry Potter happened, the genuine massive marketability of youth audiences became exceedingly apparent. The product boom that came as a result of Harry Potter was almost entirely unheard of and really made way for that kind of marketability we saw with kids' toys extended into teens. And honestly, adults. So I see Harry Potter as a little bit of a bridge. It's appropriate for a lot of ages, but it very firmly showed publishers how much money books specifically marketed to a YA audience could make. But I think the first thing that really sparked off what the average person thinks of when they think young adult is Twilight.
Young teenagers are biting to show affection.
I was already reading a lot of books in what was described as the teen section of chapters, but coming across Twilight and experiencing the explosion out of that was undeniable. From Twilight's popularity, we saw a huge push for young adult stories that involved romantic vampires, largely featuring female protagonists, which is just an area that YA does well in general. And I feel like this is where we started seeing the major trends. And before Twilight took off, I remember reading some books with vampires and werewolves as the central subject when I was in middle school. Some were for kids or young adults like the Vampire's Assistant series, but others, I can assure you, I should not have been reading at that age. But after Twilight, there were immediately dozens of vampire-related stories being pumped out that were intended for teens. They featured the romanticism and allure that had been established by Anne Rice, but were much more appropriate for younger audiences. It amped up the melodrama, which we loved, and set a lot of the stories in high school, or at least with teenage protagonists. It was a pretty big deal. Then Twilight got its movie, which they clearly didn't anticipate being as successful as it ended up being based on its relatively tight $37 million budget, and that just added a new dynamic. Not only can you market these books to teens, but you can also make multi-million-dollar franchises out of them. There were a lot of successful book series that didn't really manage to push themselves into that like movie or series area. The exception here, I believe, would be Vampire Diaries. Those books actually started releasing in the 90s, then came back almost 20 years later after Twilight popped off before being turned into an extremely successful television series. They stole my girl Nina from Degrassi for that. But all too quickly, we switched to a different style of teen fiction, the dystopian future. Enter the Hunger Games. And because Twilight had already shown that books often disregarded as lame fiction for teenage girls could make bank at the box office, the Hunger Games movie actually got a budget. And again, this led to a lot of other dystopian fiction coming out, leading to massive success, like the Divergent series. And I'm not suggesting that dystopian futures and vampires in teen fiction didn't exist before the Hunger Games and Twilight. I read a bunch of that kind of stuff when I was younger. It's just those are the clear markers of what blew up in the space that encouraged publishers to look for more of it. And these aren't the only areas that we saw these big booms in. Obviously, there was a huge push in the contemporary area after John Green novels started really taking off, and the list goes on. And because of those tropes and trends growing with the intention of publishers making money, we can end up with some issues with the themes and portrayals and even the writing styles. And this isn't exclusive to the YA area. These trends exist in everything from music to movies to books for adults to books for children. It's just a natural progression of life. When something makes a lot of money, other people are going to try to replicate that success in some way, or at least build off of that success. It's why there's a laundry list of other sexed up Twilight fanfiction that was turned into novels. But there are some issues that I do think have merit in the space, one being publisher interference. They might push for clones rather than unique stories, pushing something that was intended to be a one-shot into being a series. Their end goal is essentially to make as much money as possible. And yes, there are obviously people working in the publishing space that have a genuine passion for stories, for literature, for the things that they are providing to the world, but it would be foolish to think that money doesn't push that wheel in a lot of ways. Another one that a lot of people complain about just for existing, but I do think has issues in certain areas, are romance in YA. For me, it would specifically be romance that feels forced or unnatural, or something that really didn't need to be in the story that's just there so that they can capitalize off something that is already very popular. With something like Twilight, that romance is the catalyst of the story. It's a teen romance that just happens to have vampires in it. And honestly, the more it tried moving away from that is when the whole series fell apart for me. Like, how did we start with teen melodrama and then move into vampire babies and vision battles? Anyways, I've obviously discussed the many issues I have with how the relationship is portrayed in Twilight. We'll definitely be discussing that more when Midnight Sun comes out. I have that pre-ordered. I am excited. But either way, the romance in that is the intention. It's also why relationships in a lot of coming-of-age stories and LGBTQ stories make sense as well. First loves and attraction make up a huge part of adolescence. So obviously that's going to be reflected in stories of people growing up. And teens tend to love love. They love reading about it. They want to experience it. Nothing feels better than that concept of your one true love soulmate. And so many of these stories promise that to the extreme. And also, people of every age love shipping couples. It's why certain fanfiction gets so big. It's why people have OTPs. It is the cause behind the Team Edward versus Team Jacob debate. Regardless of age, people like a pairing. It's a demographic that obviously appeals to a lot of people, so obviously publishers would push for that, and honestly, authors would probably want to include it in their stories, even when it doesn't necessarily make sense to. I've watched videos from people who read a lot complain about romance narratives in certain stories and the insistence on love triangles, turning friends into relationship options, not properly establishing character before you're just like, now kiss. But again, to me, that's more of a writing problem than it is the concept of just including relationships in general. And this also kind of leads into the issue with how some of these relationships are even portrayed. A lot of them romanticize stalking and over-attachment and watching people sleep without their consent or knowledge. It's just so cute. There's a literal subgenre that I refer to as the teen death romance. There's so many love triangles and the idea that we're all gonna meet our soulmates in high school and learn all of our life lessons in those moments. When in reality, so many people learn things from early relationships starting and ending. And because of that, we probably shouldn't over-romanticize the idea of getting it right the first time. But there's also a lot of YA books that actually examine some of these more harmful themes. Why people are likely to fall into behaviors in relationships that aren't super healthy, and how they work their way through and out of them. So while romance is an area that can be criticized in a lot of YA books and the movies that come as a result, it also opened up the door to criticize the actual fans just for the fact that they like them rather than criticizing the tropes themselves, which, as mentioned, are often teenage girls. And this is something that I've noticed for a while. When I read Twilight for the first time, I was the target age demographic for that story. And I still felt embarrassed for reading it. And that was before it got popular and had any kind of reputation behind it. There was just still something inside of me that said, if people know that you're reading a teenage vampire romance, they are going to judge you. And thankfully, I've gotten over that. I don't give a shit, and neither should you. There's no denying that there are things that are acceptable to me and mega fans, fan of and things that are seen as unacceptable to be a mega fan of. And sadly, society often dictates that things that teenage girls are passionate about are lesser than in some way. Now, we can debate the quality of storytelling between Twilight and Harry Potter or Perks of Being a Wallflower, but people ripped Twilight fans to shreds for the sheer crime of loving something that they deemed cringe and still do. Like, if the most interesting thing you can find to criticize Twilight about is the fact that their diamond tough skin shimmers in the sunlight, that's not even something that I think about when I go to point out issues in Twilight. Okay, they're allergic to garlic, that seems logical. They can't see themselves in mirrors, that's totally fine. Oh, but these ones have diamond tough pale skin that shimmers, stupid. Like, damn, even my pasty skin sparkles when the sun hits it. It even got to the point where girls saw not liking Twilight as a badge of honor, because society essentially said that you were lesser than for liking it. And I'll clarify again that I have a lot of issues with Twilight, but I also kind of love it. But the way people treated Twilight fans sucked. When making this video, I actually came across Lindsay Ellis's Dear Stephanie Meyer video, which I think illustrates a lot of the points I'm trying to make in this video better than I really could. Nerd culture has been growing over the past 20 years, and the stuff that people would have been insulted for liking decades ago, like comic books and superheroes, are now seen as super cool. And even when looking at franchises that people do critique, like Transformers and the ridiculous nature of the Fast and the Furious, the fans of those series are not the aim of the ridicule the same way young adult fans are. Unless fan behavior gets to the point where it's also abusive and over the top and problematic in other ways, there is literally no reason to insult somebody for liking something. We live in a world where teenagers get insulted for not reading, but also for reading the things that are literally being marketed to them. As I've discussed before in some of my generational war videos, a lot of younger people are often put into situations where they can't win. If you like something that's considered appropriate, you might get questioned or quizzed about it. If you're unfamiliar with something, you're gonna get criticized for that. And if you like something that companies are literally spending millions of dollars to market specifically to you as an individual, you still get insulted. It's why I hate the fact that there's the concept of the guilty pleasure. Yes, I enjoy things that I either know or learn to know have issues, but I don't feel guilty for liking it, and neither should anyone else. So in conclusion, reading young adult books does not make you a lesser reader. Liking Twilight or Cassandra Clare or John Green does not make you a bad person or a fake reader. These books can be incredibly important to people, serve as an escape for teenagers. Hell, they can serve as an escape for adults, because that's what books do. It might open up their mind to issues they've never personally experienced before. It might put a name to feelings they've had their entire lives. And keep that in mind when I inevitably dunk on something that fits into this category. That it's not a criticism of your taste, it's just a criticism. You go on loving what you love, because sometimes a young adult story is exactly what we all need. To reflect on things you might have experienced when you were younger but never really had a chance to fully process. Sometimes it's just really nice to read a fantasy that isn't 800 pages with size 6 font. I still go through periods of time where I'm just really into reading young adult fiction. I'm in one of those moods right now. I've been devouring coming of age stories I feel like I missed out on as a teenager, because the ones that relate to me the most just didn't really exist in any kind of quantity. So that's gonna do it for this video. I'm pretty sure it ended up being way longer than I intended it to be. I think reading is a super cool thing that should be encouraged, and it shouldn't matter what you like as long as it makes you happy. What are some of your guys' favorite young adult stories? Let me know what you're thinking in the comment section down below. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. Leave a like on the video if you're into that kind of thing. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and we'll catch you all later.